1291. The Templars stand on the walls of their final great stronghold in the Holy Land and defend it to the death against the attack of a massive Mamluk army led by a sultan committed to their destruction. 1314. The last Grandmaster of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, is bound to a stake at Paris and condemned to death. But before he burns, the Grandmaster pronounces a curse that God will avenge his wrongful death. This is the history of the final struggles of the Knights Templar. In the Holy Land, in the last decades of the 13th century, the Templars held firm against a renewed and powerful onslaught from their Muslim enemies, going down fighting against the Mamluks of Egypt. Then, in France, the Templars faced an even greater danger, the wrath of the French king Philip IV. What led to the French king's arrest of the Knights Templar? Once these men had been the king's close allies, why did he suddenly decide to have them all destroyed? And what is the truth of the matter? Were the Templars heretics, blasphemers, or were they wrongfully accused? Today on Real Crusades History, we'll explore the final battles of the Knights Templar in the Holy Land, followed by their trial and destruction in France under the power of King Philip IV. Through it all, we'll try to answer the most enduring mysteries related to the downfall of the Knights Templar. Join us, and remember, there's no better teacher than history.
Before we get into today's video, check out my historical novel set during the Crusades. Why Does the Heathen Rage? Based closely on primary source material, Why Does the Heathen Rage plunges you into the action of the early Crusades era. It is 24 years since the first Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. Robert de Burris is a young knight whose father rose to power in the new Crusader kingdom. Robert has been a trusted retainer to Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, a veteran of the First Crusade, who now rules the beleaguered Christian kingdom. In Aleppo, the Turkish emir, Balak, has raised a vast army and promises to defeat the Crusaders once and for all. Princess Melisende feels the weight of the future pressing down upon her, for her father has no son, and she is the heir to a kingdom that her people believe would be better inherited by a warrior prince. Why Does the Heathen Rage explores a rarely examined chapter in Crusades history. Click the link in the pinned comment or in the description box below to pick up a copy or get it on Kindle today. And now on with our topic. It is a common myth that the Crusader states, or Outre-mer, the lands beyond the sea, were in decline all through the 13th century. In fact, after the successes of the Third Crusade in the 1190s, the Crusader states went through a major revival and rose to become a serious regional power once again in the first half of the 13th century. In some ways, the reduced size of the Crusader states made them more defensible, with the coastal fortresses and cities being heavily militarized, allowing for flourishing trade. Christian shipping continued to dominate the Mediterranean. It wasn't until the defeat of Louis IX's Seventh Crusade in 1250 that the Crusader states entered a period of ever-increasing peril. The declining means of the local barons shifted the burden of Outre-mer's defense more and more onto the military orders, especially the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. With their vast estates and financial assets throughout the Christian West, the Templars and the Hospitallers could finance the castles, mercenaries, ships, and supplies needed to protect the Crusader states. As warrior monks dedicated to the crusading ideal, these men were the obvious defenders of the Latin East, and as the 13th century drew toward its close, that mission became ever more dangerous. At the heart of the late Crusader states was the great port city of Acre. Since the loss of Jerusalem in 1187, Acre had acted as the capital of the Crusader kingdom. With its excellent harbor, beautiful churches, and thriving commerce, Acre was the jewel of Outre-mer. Here, the Templars and Hospitallers established powerful fortresses to act as command centers for all their operations in the east. It was a period when the resolve of the Templars was put to the ultimate test. In the face of an enemy that seemed to be always growing in power, the Templar brothers showed themselves time and time again to be unwavering in their dedication and willing to pay the ultimate price to defend the Latin East. In the 1250s, the Ayyubids, Saladin's dynasty, which had dominated the Muslim East since the late 12th century, collapsed. The power that brought them down emerged from their own ranks. The Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of mostly Turkish origin, had been the driving force of the Ayyubid armies since the days of Saladin himself. Taken by slavers from the frontiers of the Islamic world, Mamluks were trained to be the ultimate warriors, fiercely loyal to their masters and fearless on the battlefield. Mamluks formed the bodyguard of the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih and had been critical in defeating Louis IX's army during the Seventh Crusade. But after As-Salih's death, the new Sultan, Turan Shah, mistrusted the Mamluk guard and tried to replace them. The Mamluks prevented this, assassinating Turan Shah on May 2nd, 1250. The Mamluk commander Aybeg emerged as the new power in Egypt, and the Mamluk dynasty was born. After a series of assassinations and brutal power struggles, the Sultan Qutuz emerged as the Mamluk ruler of Egypt in 1259. It was Qutuz who led the Mamluks to victory against the Mongols at the landmark Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. Then, Qutuz himself was assassinated that same year, replaced by his chief general, Baibars. Qutuz's rule had lasted less than a year, not so shocking, in the violent history of the Mamluk dynasty, where assassination or deposition often ended the reigns of sultans. Baibars is rightly the best remembered of the Mamluk sultans. He was an outstanding general and a shrewd politician. He was a Kipchak Turk, likely born in around 1228 in the steppe region north of the Black Sea. During the Mongol expansion, Baibars witnessed the massacre of his own parents, after which he was sold as a slave in the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Eventually, Baibars was purchased by a wealthy Egyptian who brought him to Cairo. Here, Baibars was acquired by the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih. He was a leading commander during both the Seventh Crusade and the Battle of Ain Jalut. By the time he orchestrated the assassination of his former leader, Qutuz, Baibars' own personal power base was already strong. He took the throne of the Sultan and subdued Muslim Syria and Iraq, transforming the Mamluk state into a sprawling empire. Cairo was his capital, and there Baibars installed an Abbasid prince as caliph in 1261, making Egypt the new center of the now largely symbolic Abbasid Caliphate. Having acquired a vast empire, Baibars now turned his attention to the Crusader states. He resolved to eliminate these Latin Christian outposts once and for all. Using the resources of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, the Mamluk Baibars was able to field armies of tens of thousands of men in his operations against the Crusader states, while the Christians struggled to fully staff their garrisons. Baibars opened his hostilities against the Crusaders with an attack on Galilee in 1263, in which he destroyed the Cathedral of Nazareth. In 1265, he captured Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266, he took the Templar castle of Safed, and in 1268, he took the port of Jaffa. Also, in 1268, he besieged Antioch. Antioch, one of the great cities of the old Roman world, was still overwhelmingly Christian when the Crusaders captured it from the Seljuk Turks in 1098. The once powerful Principality of Antioch was, by the late 13th century, greatly weakened and reduced. When Baibars arrived before the city with his besieging force, many of the citizens, including the Prince of Antioch, Bohemond VI, had already fled. The garrison was woefully undermanned, and the siege lasted only 4 days. Baibars now unleashed his cruelty on Antioch's helpless non-combatants. The Sultan ordered the city gates locked, and then he massacred the population, including the women and children. It was a shocking and needless atrocity, with bloodlust its only apparent motivation. The city had already been fully captured by Baibars. What was the point of murdering its civilians? Thomas Madden calls it the single greatest massacre of the entire crusading era. Baibars was angered to learn that the Prince of Antioch, Bohemund VI, wasn't present for the city's final agony. To make up for this, Baibars sent a gruesome letter to Bohemund in which he gleefully recounted the sufferings of the city's innocents. Centuries later, Baibars' words remain shocking. You would have seen your knights prostrate beneath the horses' hooves, your houses stormed by pillagers and ransacked by looters, your women sold 4 at a time and bought for a dinar of your own money. You would have seen the crosses in your churches smashed, the pages of the false testaments scattered, the tombs of the patriarchs overturned. You would have seen your enemy trampling on the place where you celebrate the Mass, cutting the throats of priests, monks, and deacons on your altars, bringing sudden death to the patriarchs and slavery to the royal princes. The loss of Antioch was the greatest blow to the Crusader states since the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. It marked a new era of mounting peril for the Latin East. The coastal towns and fortresses were increasingly exposed to the Mamluk menace. But Baibars wanted to show the Franks, that is, the Crusaders, that they weren't safe anywhere. In 1271, he launched a major attack on Cyprus. Conquered by Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade, the island of Cyprus had been a crucial and wealthy Crusader base for nearly a century. Due to Christian naval predominance, the island was generally safe from Saracen attack. Baibars intended to change that. A fleet of 16 Mamluk galleys drove for Cyprus. But as they approached the port of Limassol, on the island's southern end, the first galley struck a shoal and wrecked, after which nearly all the other Mamluk galleys wrecked as well. It was a startling disaster. Large numbers of Mamluk troops drowned, while the survivors were rounded up and imprisoned by the Crusaders. The Muslim chronicler Al-Ayani says that 1,800 Mamluk troops were taken captive. To the Franks and their Eastern Christian allies, it was a welcome reverse for the seemingly invincible Mamluks. Cyprus would remain a Christian refuge. In 1271, Prince Edward of England led a crusade that prompted Baibars to agree to a 10-year truce, buying the Crusader states a crucial respite. The Templars, Hospitallers, and the Barons of Outremer used the period to try to regroup and refortify. Their holdings were now limited to a strip of coast from Atlit to Markab and a small enclave to the north at Latakia. In 1277, amid a Mamluk factional struggle, Baibars himself was killed, possibly by poisoning. For 3 years, an internal conflict raged, in which the sons of Baibars tried to hold their father's empire. They were challenged primarily by Qalavun, a leading Mamluk chieftain. Baibars' son, Al-Sa'id Baraka, tried to have Qalavun arrested and disposed of, but ultimately Qalavun prevailed, and it was Baibars' sons who were cast aside. In 1280, Qalavun fully realized his ambitions and emerged as the new Mamluk Sultan. By now, central government had generally degraded in the Crusader states, and Qalavun made separate treaties with various Crusader cities and fortresses. However, Qalavun decided to break his agreements with the Crusaders and resumed his campaigns. In May of 1285, he besieged Markab, a powerful castle of the Knights Hospitaller. The defenders of Markab held out and the siege was difficult, but the Mamluks finally captured the fortress. Then, in 1287, the Sultan attacked and conquered Latakia, the last city of the old Principality of Antioch. In 1289, Qalavun moved on to Tripoli, held by the Crusaders since 1109. After a month-long siege, Tripoli fell in May, and Calavoun massacred the population. Tripoli, like Antioch, represented a landmark loss. The final capital of the original 4 Crusader states had fallen. The Franks of Outremer dispatched desperate letters to the Christian West, pleading for assistance. Rumors circulated that Acre would be the Sultan's next target. Western kings and rulers sent a great deal of money to aid the Holy Land. King Alfonso III of Aragon wrote to the Templar Grandmaster, William of Beaujeu, to tell him that he would be dispatching supplies to the beleaguered Crusader outposts. But what was really needed was men, and far too few were arriving. Occasional small contingents would show up to reinforce Outremer's beleaguered garrisons, and while this was always welcome support, they were too small and too few. The Templars and Hospitallers most urgently urged the rulers of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire to launch major crusades to the east to come themselves with the full strength of their armies. King Edward of England insisted that he wanted to, but that he had other matters to deal with first. Other kings said much the same. One almost gets a sense of guilt when reading between the lines of letters sent to Outremer by the crowned heads of Christian Europe at this time. The Holy Land remained the great ideal of the age, and men still felt the weight of the duty to follow the example of their crusading forefathers. But the immediate politics of Europe's kingdoms always distracted from this higher ideal, especially as the monarchies became more centralized and more powerful. The crusade was always the next thing to be gotten to once the current urgent business of the day was settled. In 1290, Calavoun prepared for the killing blow, an attack on Acre. Since the late 12th century, Acre had functioned as the capital of Outremer, a first-class port with the most powerful fortifications in the Holy Land. The city was a prime commercial hub, and the Mamluks themselves benefited from its commercial activity, one reason why Baybars and other Mamluk sultans had been reluctant to move against it. But Acre's reduction, Calavoun knew, would put an end to the Frankish power on his border, and the time had come to get the job done. Calavoun died in November of 1290, but his son, the new Sultan, Al-Ashraf, made it his first order of business to finish his father's work of capturing Acre. Al-Ashraf sent a letter to William of Beaujeu, advising him to prepare for war. By now, Grandmaster William was around 60 years old, a veteran of the Templar Order. He'd begun his career as a Templar almost half a century earlier, fighting alongside the Knights of Louis IX of France during the 7th Crusade. After that disaster, he spent the rest of his life watching the situation of the Crusader states grow steadily worse, but his commitment never wavered. He was intensely committed to Christian rule in the Holy Land, and like many of the most dedicated Templars, found himself assigned to the front lines of the Crusades. He'd been named Grand Master in 1273, just in time to struggle to hold what remained of Outremer as the Mamluk threat grew ever more overwhelming. Now, William stood on the walls of Acre alongside his Templar brothers when an enormous Mamluk army appeared before the city in April 1291. Al-Ashraf's army was likely the largest ever assembled during the history of the Crusades, and brought with it a full 100 siege machines. William and the other commanders had done all they could to prepare, but as usual, they were woefully short of men. The Mamluk army outnumbered the Christian defenders 7-1. The Grand Masters of the 3 largest military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, were all present to personally command their men. Amalric, brother of the King of Cyprus, was present with a contingent of troops. Every able-bodied man in Acre was called on to take up a position on the wall. It was lost on no one that this would be the final battle for the Holy Land. The Sultan's attack on Acre was meant to destroy the city once and for all. In March 1291, al-Ashraf's army departed Egypt for Acre. It was joined by contingents from every corner of the Mamluk Empire, including Syria. One of the Mamluk mangonels, brought by the Hama contingent, had to be transported in 100 carts and took a month to be moved the 125 miles to Acre. The Crusader states no longer had a field army, so the Muslim advance was unopposed. By April 5, a massive Mamluk coalition appeared before Acre. It was large enough to surround Acre entirely, except for the seaward side. It must have been a sobering sight to the Christians watching from the walls. The Mamluk attack on Acre began on April 6, 1291. The strategy was simple: pound the walls to rubble and overwhelm the Christians with the vast numbers of the Sultan's army. Christopher Tyerman states that the Mamluk army likely outnumbered the civilian population of Acre itself, which, before the evacuation leading up to the siege, had amounted to somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people. Al-Ashraf's siege machines hammered the walls of the city both day and night. Thousands of Muslim sappers worked to tunnel under the walls with the goal of bringing them crashing down. Despite the immensity of the Mamluk assault, Acre held firm for the first weeks. Templars, Hospitallers, and other fighters on the walls and before the gates were relentless and inflicted serious casualties on the Sultan's vast army. Tyerman notes that Acre's defenders probably numbered around 1,000 knights and 14,000 infantry in total. Without question, they were staggeringly outnumbered. The military orders were the backbone of the Christian defense. Their discipline and courage prevented the defense from collapsing into panic. Venetians and Pisans played a key role in holding the walls, as did a regiment of English crusaders and troops from Cyprus. Fortunately, most of the women, children, and other non-combatants were already evacuated to Cyprus by the time the siege began. One advantage held by the Crusaders was control of the sea. Supplies were brought in during the siege from Cyprus. Christian ships, staffed with crossbowmen, archers, and mangonels, were also capable of harassing the Mamluk army's flanks where it reached the shore. This created some problems for the Mamluks, but ultimately, the attacks were too insignificant to seriously hinder al-Ashraf's operations. Abu al-Fida, one of al-Ashraf's vassals, provides a valuable eyewitness account of the siege. His chronicle includes fascinating descriptions of the Christian naval attacks. He writes, "The battle raged furiously. The Franks did not close most of the gates. In fact, they left them wide open and fought in front of them in their defense. The Hama army was in its usual position on the distant right wing. This meant that we were on the seashore with the sea on our right when we faced Acre. We were attacked by troops landing from the boats protected by wood-faced frames covered with buffalo hides, from which they shot at us with bows and ballistas. Thus, we found ourselves fighting on two fronts, the city and the sea. A ship came up with a catapult mounted on it that battered us and our tents from the sea. We were severely hindered by it, but one night when a fierce wind blew up, the ship was buffeted on the waves and the catapult broke up and was not rebuilt." Without a large fleet arriving from the west, the situation was probably hopeless. The goal of the Grandmasters of the military orders was to hold out and inflict unacceptable casualties on the Mamluk army, thus forcing the Sultan to withdraw. There was at least some reasonable hope of achieving this goal, but ultimately, this was more about making a final stand. These men were willing to die rather than see Acre fall, and they hoped to spill as much Mamluk blood as possible before they went down. On April 15, William of Beaujeu launched a night attack on the section of the Muslim camp of the army's Hama division. The Templars and their companions achieved surprise and initially caused panic among the Hama troops. But the darkness caused confusion on both sides, and ultimately the Muslims were able to rally and throw back the attack. Beaujeu and his men retreated to the city after losing 18 troops. By May 8, Acre's mighty defenses were severely damaged. On May 15, the Mamluks launched a fierce assault on the Gate of St. Anthony. The Templars and Hospitallers held the position and fought fiercely. It was a brutal, bloody clash as the Mamluks struggled to overwhelm the Christian defenders. But the Brother Knights held firm and defeated this assault. It was a moment that tested the Templars and the Hospitallers to their limit. The Mamluks withdrew after losing many of their companions before the Gate of St. Anthony. Al-Ashraf was furious. By now, Acre's defenders were exhausted and hungry. Many had been wounded, and only those most seriously wounded neglected to maintain their post on the walls. On May 18, the Sultan launched yet another all-out assault. The sky blackened with the arrows of the attackers as Muslim war drums and cymbals clamored relentlessly. Finally, Al-Ashraf's sappers managed to break through one of Acre's most important fortifications, the Accursed Tower. Pouring into the city, the Mamluks were met by the military orders, who battled to hold the invaders back. The aged Templar Grandmaster was resting at the time, but as soon as he learned what was happening, he got to his feet and rushed out to help his men. Hard street fighting ensued through Acre's narrow streets. The Mamluks battled to advance, while the Templars, Hospitallers, and other Crusaders sold every inch of street at a high price in Mamluk lives. William of Beaujeu was wounded mortally during this fighting. He was around 60 years old, and he'd not hesitated to personally take part in the most desperate battles of the siege. He died on his feet, fighting for Acre. His men followed his example and fought on. Panic spread through the city, and the few citizens remaining scrambled to board any ships still in the harbor. By evening, the Mamluks had control of virtually all of Acre. Only the Templar fortress, jutting out over the sea at the southwest corner of the city, remained in Christian hands. Here, the Templars, Hospitallers, and other surviving defenders, as well as the remaining women and children, congregated for a final stand. At first, Al-Ashraf tried to break down the fortress with his engines, but after a week, the stronghold, which was particularly well constructed, still held firm. Intensely annoyed and hoping to end things quickly, the Sultan offered terms to the Templar Marshal, Peter of Sévères, who agreed to surrender if the women, children, and everyone else inside the Templar complex were allowed to depart unmolested. The Sultan granted these terms. However, when the Mamluk officers entered the fortress, they began to harass the women and children, arguing over who would have which as his slave. Witnessing this, the Templars were furious. Drawing their swords, they slew the offending Mamluks. Barring shut the doors of the fortress, the Templars and their comrades vowed to fight to the death. Enraged, Al-Ashraf commanded his men to destroy the Templar stronghold. As the Mamluks struggled to break through, the Christians held their ground. At last, on May 28, the Sultan's sappers collapsed the outer wall. Mamluks rushed in through the breach, only to meet the swords of the Templars and their fellow Crusaders. A battle raged, but apparently the sappers had done their work too well. Suddenly, the entire structure collapsed, killing everyone inside, Crusaders and Mamluks alike. So, in their final moment of defiance, the Templars and their comrades had slain one more enemy force. The siege of Acre was over. Al-Ashraf had triumphed, but at terrible cost. The Christian defenders had bled the Sultan's army severely and gone down only after taking many of their enemies with them. It was a tragic, but in some ways poetic end to the history of the Crusades in the Holy Land. The Templars, Hospitallers, and other Crusaders had gone down fighting. Al-Ashraf ordered any last stragglers found alive in the city beheaded. Then, he had the entire city razed to the ground. With the fall of Acre, the remaining Crusader outposts were no longer defensible. Tyre was evacuated and abandoned. At Sidon, the Templars elected a new Grandmaster, Theobald Gaudin. By August, Sidon, Tortosa, and Atlit were all evacuated. Atlit in particular had long symbolized Templar resistance, as it had never been taken by storm. The original 4 Crusader states were gone. The Mamluks had achieved total victory. The Templar of Tyre summarized the situation famously in his chronicle. Everything was lost, so that the Christians no longer held a palm of land in Syria. The Templars and other Crusaders regrouped on the island of Cyprus, now the sole remaining legacy of the Crusader states, aside from, arguably, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. The third largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, Cyprus was an important possession. It was a wealthy, prosperous kingdom, and its location made it both a safe refuge from the Mamluks and the ideal future launching point for a reconquest of the Holy Land. But only an enormous commitment from the powerful kingdoms of Western Christendom could have enabled a reversal of the verdict of 1291. Would the kings of the West be willing to launch a new crusade? In April of 1292, less than a year into his tenure, Theobald Gaudin died. He was replaced as Grandmaster by Jacques de Molay, a veteran of the wars in the Holy Land. He'd been a Templar since 1265. He was an intelligent, dedicated, and well-respected man. His task of leading the Templars in the aftermath of their greatest defeat was unenviable, and yet he took to it eagerly. As history would reveal, far greater challenges lay in the future for Jacques de Molay. Like Hugh of Payenne, the French knight who'd founded the Templars some 2 centuries earlier, Jacques seems to have been a man whose moment had come. The Templars were in a difficult position. Their great struggle had finally been lost. What would be the future of the crusading cause, of the military orders themselves? Would Christendom just give up on this old ideal? Would it be easier now for Christian kings to ignore the pleas for assistance from the Templars who no longer had anything tangible to defend in the Holy Land? One of the most striking aspects of the Templars is the endurance of their appeal. For nearly 2 centuries, they were widely idealized across Latin Christendom. The call of crusade might have often been put aside for more practical business in politics, but crusading remained the stuff of inspiration. In noble courts across Europe, it was songs of crusaders that were performed for both lords and ladies. The Templars, as warriors of faith, figured prominently in such an outlook. James of Vitry, the Bishop of Acre, called the Templars lions in war, mild as lambs at home, in the field, fierce knights, in church like hermits or monks, unyielding and savage to the enemies of Christ, benevolent and mild to Christians. The German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach cast them as pure warriors, disciplined and steadfast. In August of 1291, Pope Nicholas IV called councils to meet in February to discuss the recovery of the Holy Land. Among the topics to be discussed, whether or not the military orders should be consolidated into a single order. The idea here was to pool the resources of the Templars, Hospitallers, and other knightly orders to create a more efficient force in the fight for the Holy Land. Charles II of Anjou suggested that the order be led by a man of royal ancestry with a claim to the throne of Jerusalem. Certainly, Europe's nobility would have preferred to have a more direct control over the military orders. The Catalonian philosopher Ramon Lull suggested that the new order be called the Order of the Holy Spirit, and that its leader be a celibate prince or widowed king. Finally, at the Council of Arles in 1292, Pope Nicholas issued an order that the Templars and Hospitallers be united, but the Pope's death in April of that year prevented the plan from being implemented. For the next 2 years, the question of who would be Pope distracted from the Templar issue. The cardinals assembled to elect a pope in 1292, but by 1294 they still hadn't agreed on a candidate. The aged Pope Celestine V briefly occupied the seat of St. Peter, and then at last Pope Boniface VIII took the papal throne on Christmas Eve 1294. A member of one of Rome's most distinguished aristocratic families, Boniface was a highly learned jurist with broad experience as a diplomat. Here was a man well equipped to navigate the turbulent politics of early 14th century Europe. In 1294, Boniface invited Jacques de Molay to the papal court to discuss the future of the Templars and the calling of a new crusade. This was a critical escalation of the conflict between the French king and the Pope, but Boniface VIII was no easy opponent. Deeply knowledgeable of church law and dedicated to the teachings on papal authority, Boniface would not allow the King of France to usurp his rights. Philip sought nothing less than the removal of the Pope from power. His lawyers argued that the French crown was absolute master of the church in France, that the Pope had no right to govern the church in France. Not surprisingly, Boniface decided to excommunicate Philip from church membership. Excommunication was an ancient tool of the Bishop of Rome, reserved for those Christians who gravely violated Christian teaching and refused to repent. Boniface prepared to issue a bull of excommunication on September 8, 1303. But on September 7, a French army under the leadership of Philip's jurist, Guillaume de Nogaret, approached the city of Anagni, where Boniface was staying. Nogaret captured the Pope, held him prisoner for 3 days, and had him beaten and tortured. The goal was to dispatch the Pope to Paris, where he would be tried and deposed by the royal court. Outraged, the townspeople of Anagni fought and overwhelmed the French, freeing the Pope, who fled to Rome. But the Pope's injuries were severe, and he died several days later. The Pope's bull of excommunication against Philip was never published, but remained on hand at the papal court, hanging over Philip's head, as Barbara Fraile describes it, like a sword of Damocles. News of Philip's abuse of a sitting pope spread across Christendom. For the average person, it was unthinkable that a king would treat the pope in this way. The incident further darkened the French king's reputation, even in his own kingdom. Throughout Boniface VIII's conflict with the King of France, the Templars remained staunchly loyal to the Pope. However, the Templars also had a close relationship with the French crown. As Templar operations grew over the course of the Crusades, the Templar brothers developed a system by which pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land could protect their finances. A pilgrim could deposit funds with a Templar house in England, France, or somewhere else in Europe. Then, once the pilgrim arrived in the Holy Land, his funds were available to him at a Templar house in cities like Acre or Tyre. The system nullified the risk of traveling with money and enhanced the well-being of Christians journeying to the East. So effective was this arrangement, and so widely were the Templars renowned for their honesty, that powerful men called on the Templars to manage their funds. Thus it was that in the early 14th century, Philip IV borrowed money from the Templars and employed the Templars to manage his royal treasury. The growth of Templar financial operations resulted in the development of effectively two branches of the Templar organization: a financial and diplomatic branch based in Paris, and a fighting branch based in first the Holy Land and then in Cyprus after 1291. The Templars tended to place individual Templars based on their personal aptitudes. The courageous and physically strong were assigned to the front lines in the Holy Land or the Iberian Peninsula, while the more diplomatic or administratively capable brothers were assigned to houses in Europe, such as Paris, where they would manage the more mundane day-to-day affairs of the order. The active war zone of the Holy Land required more than just physical prowess. It also demanded mental toughness, the ability to maintain cool in the face of terrifying situations, to understand the Saracens, to deal with them diplomatically, and to manage visiting Crusader forces, as well as the ability to manage fortresses and garrisons, to keep men properly equipped, large numbers of horses in good shape, and food and supplies well stocked. Back in Europe, on the home front, the Templars needed to keep up to date on the situation in various courts throughout Christendom, to understand conflicts between rulers, and to help resolve tensions diplomatically. These Templars also needed to be money smart, to manage the Order's finances well, and to be trustworthy, so that the Order's high reputation remained intact. They also needed to have a good sense of business, to be able to manage various properties, assets, and enterprises. These dual roles of the Templars made them very close to the rulers of Christian Europe, especially the King of France. In 1306, King Philip continued to dig himself into a deeper financial hole. His war against Edward Longshanks had devastated the royal treasury, and so Philip ordered the reduction of the gold content of his currency by 2/3. This policy caused open revolt in the streets of Paris. Fleeing from crowds of citizens determined to hang him, King Philip and his court took refuge in the stronghold of the Templars. Later legend states that Philip, on this occasion, saw the wealth of the Templars and was so overcome with avarice that he decided then and there to destroy them and seize their property. This tale is undeniably too simplistic and theatrical, for Philip already well knew the wealth in the custody of the Templars, but it does allude to a clear truth. Philip wanted the Templars out of the way, and he wanted their money. Far more striking is the fact that the Templars likely saved the life of the man who only a year later would order their destruction. The Templars were about to learn a hard lesson. Philip IV was loyal only to himself. Whatever the case, Philip was determined to use Templar wealth to resolve his financial troubles. He sent a letter to the Templar treasurer, Jean de la Tour, and demanded 300,000 gold florins, an enormous sum equal to the annual budget of Italian city-states like Genoa or Venice. This was a tough demand, for the bulk of Templar wealth was the property of private creditors, who relied on the Templars as a trustworthy banking institution. Nevertheless, Jean did not hesitate to grant the king's request. Jean did not even ask for securities to guarantee Philip's repayment. In 1307, when Grandmaster Jacques de Molay returned from the east and saw the huge shortage in the Templar funds, he had once ordered Jean de la Tour removed from his position and expelled from the order. This might seem extreme, but it was in keeping with the rule of the order, which required that a Templar be expelled if he stole or concealed any of the order's funds in excess of 4 dinars. Jean de la Tour appealed the Grandmaster's ruling to the only man alive who could overturn it, the Pope himself. King Philip personally requested that Pope Clement V overturn de Molay's ruling. Clement complied. The Pope dispatched a message to Jacques de Molay ordering the restoration of Jean de la Tour to the order. One chronicler describes the Grand Master's rage at receiving this command. Jacques was an old Templar purist, a veteran of the order's most ferocious wars, who held firm to the letter of the rule. Jean de la Tour represented the seasoned bureaucrat. He'd been born to one of the highest ranks of the French aristocracy, and was confident that he could get the Grand Master's ruling overruled. Jacques smashed the letter from the Pope in his fist and threw it into the fire. Yet he obeyed the Pope, his master, according to the Templar rule. Jean de la Tour was fully reinstated. Barbara Frail notes that this incident reveals the conflicting obligations pulling the Templar Order in two directions. Could the Templars be both important power players in European politics and idealistic warrior monks? Could they serve the cause of the Crusade and also the King of France? Perhaps most striking is Pope Clement V's unhesitating subservience to King Philip IV. There's little question that Jacques had behaved in accordance with the Templar rule when he expelled Jean de la Tour. King Philip's personal appeal on John's behalf had certainly been crucial to the Pope's decision. A century earlier, Pope Innocent III might have thrown the French king's message in the fire himself. In 1307, Philip IV finally made his move against the Templars. The order's leadership was normally based in Cyprus, but that year, Templar leaders were visiting Paris. In a rapid maneuver, royal officials stormed Templar houses across France. Aside from the Paris stronghold, virtually none of these houses were fortified, and most of the Templars staffing these facilities were lightly armed or unarmed. Career bureaucrats or older brothers who'd long retired from the active war zones. France had always been the peaceful home front of the order. No one had ever imagined that the Templars would need to be ready for battle in the very heart of the order's operations. And yet, on October 13, 1307, Templars across France found themselves attacked by the very agents of King Philip. Some managed to escape and flee, but many were arrested and imprisoned. Torture and interrogation began almost immediately. Above all, Philip's agents wanted to secure confessions from these men to legitimize this shocking and seemingly lawless mass raid. Philip quickly moved to propagate his charges against the order. His actions, he insisted, were only the honest efforts of a pious king to discipline a corrupt order. Philip claimed that the Templars were conducting heretical initiation ceremonies in which they spat on a crucifix and denied Christ. He claimed that as part of this ritual, the Templars defiled one another sexually and worshipped a satanic idol. What evidence did Philip have for these claims? Did he have documents? Did he have physical evidence of the rituals? Did he have in his possession a satanic idol used by the Templars in one of these supposed initiations? No, he had none of these, which is why he wanted confessions from the brothers. To extract these confessions, the king's inquisitors employed torture. Torture, of course, is likely to produce a confession, regardless of whether a man is guilty or innocent. Philip was not disappointed. Between October and November, only 4 of the 138 arrested Templars refused to admit to any of the charges leveled by the king's torturers. Many held out for some time, but after repeated torture sessions, finally broke. Malcolm Barber points out the bizarre nature of this situation, especially given the French crown's closeness to the order. For decades, the Templars had operated right alongside French royal officials. Their churches and houses were integrated into royal establishments, and in Paris, their highest offices and sacred spaces were literally steps away from the king's own dwellings and sanctums. This order, whose officials were closer to the French king than many of France's highest-ranking aristocrats, is suddenly being accused of practicing outright Satanism, literally in the midst of the royal court. In effect, the King of France was admitting to harboring the most despicable of organizations in the very bosom of Paris. The instructions given to Philip's inquisitors show exactly why they were able to extract so many confessions. They read, "You are to promise them pardon and favor if they confess the truth, but if not, you are to assure them that they will be condemned to death." So, the Templar brothers were told that the only way they could obtain pardon was to admit to these charges, otherwise they would face unspeakable brutality. And what sort of tortures were employed against these unfortunate brothers? One was the fire torture, in which the victim's legs were greased with fat and then roasted over an open flame like a piece of meat. So painful was this method that the victim often went mad. Others had their arms bound behind their backs, then were raised off the ground and dropped until their shoulders dislocated. The brothers were also starved, deprived of sleep, and imprisoned in freezing temperatures without clothing or blankets. So began the great ordeal of the Templars in France. Throughout the first month, shock at the development spread across Europe. How could the Templars, long lionized as the heroes of the Crusades, stand accused of such blasphemies? For the average European at the time, it was unthinkable that the Templars could actually be guilty of such things. This is why the confessions were critical to Philip's campaign. He wanted to wave these confessions in front of Christendom, assuring that he was acting justly. But would the confessions be believed? How would the wider Christian world react?
So far, the king was unable to produce evidence for his claims, aside from confessions elicited from imprisoned Templars through torture. It might be difficult for some students of history today, looking back on the 14th century, to understand how closely integrated was the life of the Templar order in Paris with the life of the king's court and officials. Malcolm Barber points out that royal officials regularly supervised accounts at the Templar treasury and therefore were often present at the Templar treasury itself. Directly adjacent to this treasury was a chapel where the Templars received new initiates into the order, supposedly, according to the king's charges, a satanic ritual in which the brothers debauched one another, defiled crosses, and worshipped an idol. Other clients and diplomats dealing with the Templars would have been constant features of these locations as well. It's not as though guests were limited to regular business hours either, as the Templars provided accommodations to visiting dignitaries. Barber points out that the Templars would have had to have been leading meticulously crafted double lives, pretending to be ordinary Christians while at the same time engaging in such obscenities and blasphemies that any word of them leaking out would have ruined the Templar organization. Historian Barbara Frale notes that many of the documents from the proceedings were tampered with. Nevertheless, over the course of a 4-year research project, she compiled all documents related to Templar testimony during the trial. Frale notes the distinctive situation of the Templars. A Templar must be ready to abandon his own will and pledge full obedience to the dictates of the order. This was particularly important given the stakes faced by the Templars. On the battlefield, the Templars were sworn to stand and fight, even if they had been disarmed. They were to sacrifice their lives rather than retreat. For example, in 1188, when Saladin was attacking the town of Darbzak in the Principality of Antioch, once the Sultan's army broke through the walls, the Templars stood in the breach, wielding their weapons and refusing to yield. When one Templar fell, another took his place. Given the severity of the challenges faced by the Templars, Barbara Frale has theorized that perhaps there was some secret initiation performed by the Templars for the very purpose of testing them to the limit. Frale speculates that perhaps Philip's interrogators were stumbling on some aspect of this ritual and misrepresenting it as heresy and blasphemy to suit the king's policy. To understand what might have been the contents of this secret ritual, Frale points to the situation faced by a Templar brother captured in battle by Muslim enemies. Many Templars captured by Saracen forces were subject to torture, ordered to spit on or defile a cross, or to perform other illicit acts under threat of death. Frale wonders, could the Templars, after taking a new initiate through the official ceremony, have then taken him aside to a secret location and then put him through an even more severe test? Could this test have involved orders from his highest superiors to deny Christ, to spit on a cross, or perform such other blasphemy? If this is the case, what would the Templars have expected from the novice? Perhaps if the brother naturally refused at once to do any such thing, the Templar leaders would have held a knife to his throat, threatened to brutalize or even kill him. What would have been the point of this? In fact, this might have been a way to put the new Templar through the very trial he would have faced if he'd been captured in battle. The point wasn't to get him to deny Christ, it was to see what sort of man he was when faced with such a brutal situation. Would he hold firm? Would he break? If he refused, even in the face of the threat of death, then he'd passed the test. Such a man could fight in the ferocious wars of the Crusades. But if he broke down, if he succumbed to the threat of violence and showed himself willing to betray God, then he'd failed the ultimate test. He could never be a Templar, or at least he couldn't serve in the theatres of war. Barbara Frale, like Malcolm Barber, Helen Nicholson, and other Templar experts, agrees that the charges against the Templars were false, and that Philip's interrogators were weaving a fraudulent image of Templar heresy through violent questioning. But she raises some interesting possibilities. Obviously, there is much speculation in all this, but the Templars were certainly a distinctive organization. It's difficult to overstate the perils confronted regularly by Templar brothers, especially those serving on the front lines. It's not difficult to imagine that the men who led this organization would have been hardened, uncompromising individuals who sought to weed out all but the most resilient men from their order. As Frale puts it,
"The test stripped bare a man's true character, and it was at that point that courage, pride, determination, and the capacity for self-control emerged. By contrast, if what emerged was an attitude of timidity, an excessive readiness to obey, or, on the other hand, undue arrogance, the candidate was assigned to different duties."
On October 25th, Philip's officials brought the tortured and brutalized Grandmaster of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, before a public assembly. There, Philip's chief lawyer, Guillaume de Nogaret, produced the Grandmaster's signed confession, along with an order from the Templar leader to all the brothers in the order to confess to the charges leveled by the king. This was a shocking event, which scandalized the French public, who were inclined to mistrust the king's charges. The point of all this was to allow the crown to maintain control. Guillaume hoped to outmaneuver any attempt by the Pope to order the reform of the Templars, and instead to force Clement to dissolve the order. Pope Clement V was very angry that the King of France had arrested the Templars without consulting him. According to church law, the Pope alone was authorized to order such an arrest. But the King of France was, at the time, considerably more powerful than the Pope, and Philip brought enormous pressure to bear on Clement V. Initially, the Pope resisted the king's demands and even protested the arrests, but at last, on November 22nd, 1307, Clement ordered a general arrest of the Templars across Christendom to be followed by an investigation. One contemporary, writing in 1308, described the events.
"They were arrested without warning, suddenly, without right, and without any judgment being made against them. They were shamefully and dishonorably incarcerated, with destructive rage, afflicted with taunts, the gravest threats, and various sorts of torture, compelled to die or produce absurd lies which they knew nothing about."
According to this same writer, at least 36 brothers in Paris alone died under torture rather than confess to the charges. This writer, like many in France at the time, regarded the Templars as martyrs who went to their reward in heaven. Clement dispatched letters to kings and rulers throughout Christian Europe, commanding them to arrest and investigate the Templars. Outside of the French royal court, virtually no one believed the charges. The rulers of Christendom knew that Clement was acting under the domination of the French king. Philip had many enemies, and Europe's rulers were not interested in complying with his power play, but few were in a position to outright ignore him, especially since he had coerced the leader of the church into issuing commands on his behalf. The King of Naples, Charles II, was Philip's cousin and creature, and complied at once. The King of England and the King of Aragon were Philip's enemies and outright refused to comply. For the English king, this was a natural response. But James II of Aragon was considerably less powerful than Philip and could face attacks from the French on his northern border. Nevertheless, he would not obey. In Aragon, the Templars had fought heroically in the Reconquista and had been close allies to many Aragonese kings. King Denis of Portugal also refused to obey the Pope's command, but proclaimed that he found no fault or heresy with the Templars in his realm. Like the kings of Aragon, Portugal's kings had long employed Templars in the Reconquista, and Templars were well respected at the Portuguese court. Denis and other Iberian rulers entered into years of negotiations with the Pope, which ultimately resulted in the Iberian kings converting their Templars into new national orders. Reactions were mixed in the fragmented states of the Holy Roman Empire. The Archbishop of Magdeburg was already an enemy of the Templars and eager to seize Templar property, but his men were unable to fully enforce his arrest orders. In much of Germany, rulers refused, neglected, or were unable to carry out the Pope's command. Popular opinion in Germany overwhelmingly favored the Templars, and their arrest was viewed as one more proof of the French king's wickedness. Pope Clement V demanded that the case against the Templars be turned over to the Church. In December of 1307, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay and other Templar leaders imprisoned in France now revoked their confessions, confirming what was already widely believed, that the Templars had only confessed after being tortured and threatened. In an audience gathered at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Jacques removed his shirt and showed the scars of torture that covered his body. As a result, Clement declared the trial suspended in February 1308. Certain now of the bad faith underlying the trial, the Pope wanted to interrogate the Templars personally. He demanded that Philip hand his prisoners over to the Church. Worried that the Pope was about to ruin the edifice of a case he'd so tirelessly constructed, Philip now rushed to put on a show of legitimacy. He sent a series of questions to the learned doctors of the University of Paris, asking them whether he'd acted lawfully in arresting and investigating the Templar Order. As it so happened, the leading scholars of Philip's capital city announced that they were mostly in agreement with the king's position. But the doctors of Paris were careful to state in tortuous language that only the Pope ultimately had the right to judge the Templars. In early May 1308, the king gathered leading representatives of the three estates of France, the clergy, the nobles, and the bourgeois, to a parliament at Tours, where they all declared their agreement with the king's policy and pressured the Pope to reopen the case. Meanwhile, Philip's people threatened Clement's relatives and circulated allegations that the Pope was having an affair with the Countess of Périgord. Clement relented. In July 1308, the Pope agreed to reopen the trial under the supervision of the bishops. Officially, the Templars and their trial would be under the control of the Church, though Philip's agents were certain to be keeping a close eye on things and ensuring that the king's policies were being implemented. Pope Clement also declared a council would meet in 1310 in Vienna to issue a final ruling on the fate of the Templars. Philip at last allowed the Pope to question some of the Templar prisoners, though he tried to prevent papal questioning of the Templar leaders who were held in prison at the fortress of Chinon. Clement, however, was determined to gain access to the men who led the Templar Order. Historian Barbara Frale discovered in 2001 a document in the Vatican archives which showed exactly how the Pope went about achieving this end. Frale's discovery proved once and for all that the Pope knew that the Templars were innocent, and indeed that he had put this in writing at the very height of Philip's campaign against the order. This document is the Chinon Parchment, and its contents reveal one of the most fascinating chapters in Templar history. In the summer of 1308, Clement V announced that he would retire to the countryside for his summer holiday. This caused King Philip's officials to lower their guard. With the Pope out of the way for the summer, they could relax, and the royal representatives who monitored events at the papal court departed Poitiers for Paris. It was at this moment that the Pope's plan was set in motion. At dawn, three of the Pope's closest allies, Cardinals Béranger Fredol, Landolfo Brancacci, and Etienne de Suisy, departed Poitiers and travelled straight to Chinon. It is noteworthy that none of these men were on the official papal panel investigating the Templars. At Chinon, the cardinals met the members of the general staff and informed them that the Pope planned to resolve the controversy of the trial by absolving the Templars and merging them with the Hospitallers. The cardinals then performed their own investigation of the order. They found that the order did suffer from some issues of corruption and abuse of power, but nothing like the charges of heresy and blasphemy articulated by Philip. The Chinon parchment also contains details that have led Barbara Frale to believe that there may have been some secret aspect of the Templar initiation ceremony used to test the resolve of new brothers. The details of what this secret ritual may have contained are confused, but it may have involved some form of violence or threatened violence against a new initiate. The parchment confirms that the initiation didn't involve any sort of sexual debauchery or idol worship. The cardinals agreed that none of this constituted heresy or rejection of the Christian faith. Rather, the leaders of the order were to confess the sin of allowing certain irregular practices and corruptions to take place in the order, whether they knew about them or not. Such problems, according to church law, are to be corrected in a religious order through reform, and this was articulated by the cardinals. Jacques de Molay and the other Templar leaders received the sacrament of reconciliation, were absolved of their sins and confirmed as in good standing with the church. They agreed to cooperate fully with a papal commission to enact any needed reforms in the Templar order. All this was recorded in the Chinon parchment dated August 20th, 1308. Thus, by a clever ruse, the Pope had conducted his own interviews with the Templar leaders right under the king's nose. Clement V had implied to the king that the Templar question would not be settled for another 2 years, but now Clement issued a bull stating that the Templar leaders had been absolved and that no one save the Pope could so much as question them. Whatever happened now, the Pope had preserved the integrity of the Templars in the eyes of the Church. In 1309, the trial began anew. That November, the Pope set in motion a papal commission to investigate the matter. Immediately, papal investigators found that the imprisoned Templars were reluctant to speak in any way in their own defense. They all feared being tortured again, or even murdered by Philip's men. But then, a new flame of courage sparked among the imprisoned Templars. In 1310, 15 brothers declared that the charges were false and that their confessions had been coerced. This inspired others. Soon, over 600 imprisoned brothers took back their confessions and proclaimed their innocence. The inquisitors declared these brothers lapsed heretics, the punishment for which was death. On May 12, 1310, one of Philip's bishops had 54 Templar brothers burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. These Templars went bravely to their deaths, declaring even from the flames that they were innocent and that God would avenge them. The crowd watching was solemn and clearly moved by the resilience of these men. Despite the king's efforts at spreading propaganda against the order, scenes such as these all but shattered the image Philip wanted to create. Sophia Menache argues that initially the king was able to convince many ordinary people in France that his charges against the Templars were true, even if the nobility and clergy were generally skeptical. But the public defiance and courage of condemned Templars increasingly convinced many of the common folk that these men were in fact persecuted martyrs. Templar resistance coalesced around two brothers in particular, Renaud de Provence and Peter de Boulogne. Unlike most Templars, these two had some legal training and could use legal language to refute Philip's case. Other Templars were burned in other cities. They all died denying the king's charges. Philip seemed to sense that things were getting out of control, as his threats and brutality seemed increasingly powerless to silence Templar defiance. Suddenly, the jailers announced that Renaud and Peter had escaped. Neither brother was ever heard from again. Not surprisingly, few found this convenient explanation convincing. Most everyone suspected that Philip had had these two men murdered in their cells, and historians today generally suspect the same. That the King of France likely murdered 2 Templars extrajudicially says a great deal about the reality of the situation. This was a legal farce, naked power masquerading as the rule of law. Such suspicious occurrences and difficulties for the papal commission created by the crown forced the Pope to delay the Council of Vienna until 1311. When the council finally assembled on October 16, 1311, the gathered clergy were eager to finally get to the truth. However, when the first Templars appeared before the council to offer testimony, Philip's armed men arrested them. These Templars simply disappeared, much like Renaud and Peter, never to be heard from again. Philip then assembled his army and marched into Vienna on March 20th, 1312. At this point, the king dropped even the pretense of legal process. Philip simply would not allow an independent inquiry into the Templars. He'd killed another pope previously. Clement surely had no illusions about how far the king was willing to go. 2 days later, on March 22nd, Clement issued the bull Vox in Excelso, which proclaimed that the order still had not been proven guilty, but that its reputation had been tarnished to the point that it could no longer continue to exist. Thus, Clement dissolved the order, as Helen Nicholson puts it, not because the Templars were guilty, but because the Pope had no choice in the matter. The bull was read out on April 3rd, and the Pope declared that there would be no further debate. Many of the gathered churchmen were furious. They'd come here to genuinely investigate the issue, and now all investigation was being forbidden. The reality was, however, that the king's army had decided the issue. With royal troops in the city, the council was over. Clement understood that his choice was to either shut down the proceedings or face outright violence, perhaps even death. He chose the former. The situation was stark. The King of France had essentially subdued the Pope and forced him to enact royal policy through the machinery of the Church. On May 6, 1312, Clement V issued a bull granting mercy to all Templar brothers who had confessed and repented. Such Templars would be forgiven and could live out their days in monasteries, receiving a pension from the Church. For the many Templars still languishing after years of brutal imprisonment, it was a way out. Surely many of these men, regardless of their personal feelings, would be willing to just confess to what the king wanted to hear and retire to a quiet, secure life for the rest of their days. Most of all, the King of France was eager for a confession from the Grandmaster himself, Jacques de Molay. To at last have the gruff old Templar commander humbled and begging forgiveness would have been the icing on the cake to King Philip's victory over the order. As it turned out, Jacques de Molay and the other chief Templar leaders refused to take the easy way out. Even now, they rejected Philip's charges as false and refused to confess. On March 18, 1314, the Papal Commission released its final verdict. Jacques de Molay, along with Geoffroy de Charnay, the commander of Normandy, Geoffroy de Gonville, commander of Aquitaine and Poitou, and Hugh Perrot, the commander of the Ile de la France, were all condemned as relapsed heretics and sentenced to life imprisonment. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay lashed out after the verdict was read, loudly denouncing the whole trial as a farce, and thus received the death penalty as obdurate heretics. Perhaps the ultimate condemnation of Philip's policy against the Templars comes from one of his own supporters, the chronicler Geoffrey of Paris, who leaves behind a striking account of the execution of Jacques de Molay. Centuries later, Geoffrey's words are still stirring and worth quoting in full.
The master contradicted the cardinal and said to him that he believed in our Lord and that there was no more loyal and better Christian than he was. And if there happened to be any evil brother in the order, that could well be the case, for he had often heard that there are evil people everywhere. But he did not know anything in the order which did not originate in good faith and in the Christian law. He would not abandon his order, but would suffer death there for God's sake, and for justice and for right. No one present was so hard-hearted that they did not cross themselves many times when they heard him speak about his order like this. Seeing the fire ready, the master took off his clothes. I saw what I saw. He stood there in just his shirt, happily and in good spirits. He did not tremble, no matter how they dragged and prodded at him. They took hold of him to tie him to the stake. He agreed to this, happy and rejoicing. They tied both his hands with a cord, but first he said to them, "Sirs, at least let me join my hands together for a little while and make my prayer to God, for now is the time and the season to pray. I see here my judgment, the place where I must die a short time hence. God knows that my death is wrong and a sin, so in short time evil things will befall those who have condemned us to death. God will avenge our death. Sirs, he said, you should know without any argument that all those who have acted against us will suffer for what they have done to us. I wish to die in this belief. See here my faith, and I beg you to turn my face toward the Church of Our Lady, from whom our Lord was born." His request was met. He died like this, and met his death so sweetly that everyone was amazed.
Coming from one of Philip's supporters, this is a devastating condemnation of royal policy and vindication of the Templar Grandmaster. Most of those watching Jacques de Molay die believed they were witnessing the martyrdom of a good and just man. Geoffrey of Paris ends his account quite ominously.
There is great debate in the world over this, but I don't know what to say about it. Some speak out of jealousy, others otherwise. I don't know who is telling the truth and who is lying. You can fool the church, but you can't fool God. I won't say any more. Draw your own conclusions.
Rather than being Philip's final victory against the Templars, the burning of Jacques de Molay was perhaps the king's ultimate defeat. Jacques and the other executed Templars were revered as virtual saints, with people scrambling to collect relics of their ashes after executions. Even the property of the Templars wasn't released to the French crown, but was transferred by the church to the Knights Hospitaller so that it might continue to be used in the cause of the Crusades. Not only that, but all that the king had struggled to build seemed to collapse in the wake of the Grandmaster's death. Philip himself would die less than a year later. While out hunting in November of 1314, the king fell from his horse, suffering what appears to have been a cerebral stroke. Philip lay in agony for weeks before he finally died as a result of his injuries. Some whispered, even then, that this was the curse of the Grandmaster come to fruition. Apparently, the curse wasn't finished. Within a decade and a half, 3 sons and a grandson of Philip would be dead as well. Within 14 years of Jacques de Molay's death, the 300-year-old Capetian dynasty was extinct. Pope Clement also perished that year, dying after a long illness in April. American historian Henry Charles Lee wrote, "Even in distant Germany, Philip's death was spoken of as retribution for his destruction of the Templars, and Clement was described as shedding tears of remorse for the ruin of the Templars." Helen Nicholson points out that the great question remains: why was Philip so adamant about destroying the Templars? She explains how Philip's policy toward the Templars makes much sense when taken within the context of his entire reign. Above all, this was part of the king's struggle with the Pope and his struggle for total control within his realm. The Templars, though loyal allies to the King of France, answered to the Pope alone. Clearly, Philip intended to subjugate the Pope to his own power, indeed to assert himself as the true ruler of the Church in France, unanswerable to the Pope. Destroying the Templars was one component of this. On top of that, the Templars were a great financial power in the kingdom, and Philip wanted their wealth and their properties. For a king devoid of the old ideals of the Crusades, indeed devoid of any respect for the papacy or the traditions of the Church, the Templars were simply one more obstacle for Philip to remove. They were by no means the only targets of his wrath, and he went after other political opponents with much the same allegations of heresy and profane conduct. The trial and destruction of the Knights Templar reverberated as one of the most impactful events of the late Middle Ages. Certainly, Philip failed to destroy their reputation, for long after their demise, the Templars were remembered in Christendom as heroes of the heyday of the Crusades. Future military orders would celebrate them as an inspiration, and their final Grandmaster, Jacques de Molay, became a symbol of righteous defiance in the face of tyranny. However, as time went on, the controversy surrounding the destruction of the Templars fed storytelling and legend until the Templars became one of the most sensationalized institutions of the medieval era. Poets and writers have used the Templars in stories both as heroes and as villains, as sages or as mystics. To this day, outlandish tales abound of the Templars surviving underground, founding new secret societies, or even pulling the strings behind power. Such views of the Templars have morphed well beyond history into the realm of comic book fiction. It's striking that a medieval crusading order could be transformed into such outlandish forms. But the enduring appeal of the Templars through the ages, especially as an object of speculation and myth-making, likely relates to their dramatic end. Nevertheless, despite the legends, the history of the trial of the Templars reveals that they were in fact just what they appeared to be, an order of fighting monks dedicated to the defense of Christendom. Templars were not the wizards and mystics of legend. They were in fact very ordinary men, simple fighting men with a straightforward devotion to God. They took vows to defend the innocent, to protect pilgrims, and to fight for the holy places. This they did, and directed all their efforts toward such ends. Through misfortune, they fell afoul of the most powerful man of their day, King Philip IV of France, and this, and not any genuine crimes, led to their downfall. The verdict of history is that the Templars were innocent of the charges levelled against them, and that they were, in fact, exactly what they'd always claimed to be. Their imprisonments, tortures, and executions were nothing but the abuse of power and contemptible injustices. Philip IV's fraudulent proceedings against them have earned him the reputation of a tyrant.
The yellow grass like light across the plain, and I'm just kinda thinking of when we'd walk here all around, way back when you still lived in the South. I hear the birds until the morning,